I'm Andrea.
I'm Myra.
I'm Sasha.
And I'm Cheryl, and today we are presenting on the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act of 1974. So the history of our act began with juvenile justice starting from the child saving movement in the mid-1800s. As we learned in class, this movement included specialized housing where a group of normally women would move into populations of low income, and they would have different facilities available for housing for low income families and helping different types of students and children. And during this time, the first juvenile court was actually established in 1899, and alongside the child saving movement, the federal government actually got involved and established the Children's Bureau within the federal government. After that, the president started getting more involved, and the first president that really made a big impact in the juvenile justice movement was President Eisenhower, who began to sponsor research into juvenile justice. People began to realize that children need to be treated differently than adult offenders, and that their brains and bodies were developing at different rates than adults. So there was a lot of research that began in the 50s to kind of look at the proper ways to discipline and treat children. And the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare also got involved, and they conducted conferences in order just to raise awareness and to bring attention to the need for different prevention and preventative treatments for children. Then President Eisenhower actually enacted legislation changes in the 1950s, and Senate passed the Juvenile Delinquency and Youth Control Act of 1961. So the Juvenile Delinquency and Youth Control Act was the first act enabled by legislation, and this act made grants to the state, local, and other public or nonprofit agencies to establish these pilot projects that demonstrated just a need for improvement for the prevention and control of juvenile delinquency. So after all the research had been conducted, they started implementing these in different levels of the government to start seeing what was going to work. After that, it was revised to the Juvenile Delinquency Prevention and Control Act of 1968. So this replaced the former act, and this one was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. This act had 3 titles. So the first title provided diagnosis and treatment to youth in danger of becoming delinquent. So this portion offered mental health factors and different developmental factors that go into juveniles. Also, the Title II provided assistance to train the employees that would work in the systems, and that would provide these services to the juveniles. So this really helped to make sure that the people providing these programs were trained appropriately. And then the third title of the act provided technical help to disperse needed information from all the research that was being done to the proper local communities.
So in the 60s and 70s, we saw that there was a rise in juvenile crimes, and in an effort to create a comprehensive legislation that would provide more clear guidance as to how to address this issue across all states, Congress passed the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act of 1974. And the goal of this act was to prevent and control juvenile delinquency and improve the juvenile justice system. And within this act, there were 3 outcomes. First, it created the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention within the Department of Justice to administer the act and implement it. It also created a formula grants program, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and it outlined core mandates that states must follow in order to receive this federal funding. So there are 4 core requirements for the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. The first one is deinstitutionalization of status offenders, which are juveniles that have committed crimes that would not be criminal if they were committed by an adult. The second one is adult jail and lockup removal, so separation of juveniles from adult offenders. The third one is sight and sound separation, which means that it's a removal of juveniles from adult jails. And the fourth one is racial and ethnic disparities. So there's the goal of having a reduction in the disproportionate number of juvenile minority groups members who come into contact with the juvenile justice system. And so next we're briefly going to talk about the funding for the act. Funding is provided through Title II formula grants, which are given to state and local governments. And to be eligible to receive this funding, states have to comply with 28 state plan requirements and also outline a specific 3-year plan for how they will accomplish these goals. But within those 28 requirements, the 4 core mandates are the most important since they are more specifically tied to funding. So for example, if a state is not compliant with one of the 4 core requirements, they could see that their funding can be reduced by 20% for each requirement that they are not compliant with. And additionally, states don't really receive that much funding overall for implementation. So for example, in the fiscal year 2018, there was only $60 million for all the states that was given for this act. And for California specifically, it was a little bit over $4.5 million. And so even just compared to 2010, when the funding was overall $75 million for all the states, it's been reduced to $60 million in the fiscal year 2018. So this also applies to juvenile justice programs in general, in addition to the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. So for example, in 2002, funding for all juvenile justice programs was $547 million, and in 2018 it was reduced to $283 million.
This graph shows the juvenile arrest rate trends from the 1980s to 2018. Basically, our act enabled people to track and follow these arrests, and as we can see here on the graph, after the 1990s and the peak of juvenile arrests, it declined significantly all the way down to our current trend in 2018. So we can see that our act is working.
Next, we're going to touch base on the evaluation and recommendations of the JJDPA. For this policy, we interviewed Probation Officer Deputy LaCroix, who has worked in the juvenile delinquency system for over 20 years. She currently works for the San Diego Juvenile Probation Center and caters to juveniles up to the age of 18. The facility provides several services such as Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, pet therapy, book clubs, and programs facilitated by Save San Diego and Second Chance programs. One thing that she mentioned was that although the policy contributed $60 million in block grants, she does not see the effects of the increase in fundings. She actually stated that every year there are several cuts to programs and job positions.
This graph shows the juvenile arrest rate trends from the 80s to 2016, and we can see how Black and minority juveniles have the highest arrest rates historically.
In the next slide, we're going to introduce a snippet from Officer LaCroix that we found really insightful.
And then the disproportionate number of juvenile minorities, that's always a problem. It's still a problem. I see it as a problem. The kids, the non-white kids are being arrested more frequently, charged more seriously, still. And I don't know, with all the oversight, it still surprises me when I get cases and I'm thinking, why is this charged so seriously, for example?
Do you think that's reflective of a systemic thing? Or?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's still part of our systemic institutionalized racism.
Right.
Absolutely. Even in San Diego.
So recommendations for the 2019 Act, we should definitely continue to implement the core requirements, but also focusing on community needs as well as oversight on the allocation of funds so they are properly placed. Also, we should ensure developmentally appropriate responses for justice-involved youth, meaning we should phase things out like VCOs, which are valid court orders, and that means that juveniles can get involved in the system for things like skipping school or running away. The third thing that we can change in this act is the reduction in the reliance on detention and incarceration, and instead invest in communities' resources. This can also help reduce the school to pipeline idea, which takes zero tolerance and places unfair focus on certain groups. For the fourth aspect is to ensure the fairness and equity for justice-involved youth, and this can be done through school interventions instead of having them get involved with the system, or having help from community resources. And for the fifth point is to ensure safety of these youths involved in the system by addressing issues like homelessness, abuse, neglect, poverty, and that way they are more equipped to re-enter society and the communities. So to recap, juveniles involved in the justice system deserve a fair chance to succeed, and this act focuses on those issues, and we should continue funding and improving this policy.